Hi everyone, and welcome back. So today we are talking about the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. This is the first of 3 videos. We're going to have a brief summary here. In the second video, it's going to be a little bit different than what we've done before. I'm going to talk about slave narratives and some of the features of slave narratives and how this book kind of fits in with that tradition. The third video, the face-to-face, will be looking at some of the themes in the book and digging into that a little bit more and talking about how it fits in with some of the other literary movements that we have been discussing. So let's get started. A brief overview of the author's life. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery around 1818 in Talbot County, Maryland. He tried to escape from slavery twice before succeeding, and his final attempt, he was assisted by Anna Murray, who was a free black woman living in Baltimore with whom he had fallen in love. So they married after their escape, or after his escape, and they worked for the abolition. In addition to working toward abolition, the freedom of slaves, Douglass became an outspoken supporter of women's rights. He was the only African American to attend the first Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls, New York. And he argued that he could not accept the right to vote as a black man if women could not also claim the right. So he really wanted freedom and equality for all. In 1863, he conferred with Abraham Lincoln regarding the treatment of black soldiers, and later with Andrew Johnson on the subject of black suffrage, so it became quite influential. Also writing for a newspaper that had a lot of influence at that time. And after Anna's death, he married Helen Pitts. Now, Helen was a white feminist from New York, and mixed marriages were largely illegal at that time. Many of the people in their organization, even their friends, did not approve of them getting married, thinking that it would cause too much of a stir, and they seemed not to care. They were in love and they wanted to get married. In addition to the book that we are looking at, Douglass wrote several others over the course of his life, including My Bondage and My Freedom, which was really an extended biography. This is the shorter one of his books, but I recommend, if you like this one, I think I have it in the Read Alikes, but if you like this one, My Bondage and My Freedom gives a lot more detail of the incidents that he describes. So in the narrative, it is rather short. It's only about 11 chapters long. It has an opening letter, which I didn't cover here, but I will talk about in the third video a little bit more why we have that opening letter and the purposes that it serves. This picture is, I'm going to zoom in on it for you. This picture is of some slave quarters in Maryland, possibly a little nicer than those that Douglass lived in based on some of his descriptions, but you can kind of see how they're set up. Other times, this is just one row of these tiny houses. Other times there would be the porches facing inward and having kind of like a courtyard almost area with more on the side here. The ones that I've seen at any rate. And there we go. And this does not match his descriptions really, but I want to show you, this is a slave bunkhouse in Maryland. These have been the men's quarters. Now they have some things here like a spinning wheel and things of that nature just to kind of set it up how they think it might have looked. A lot more blankets than Douglass describes. And you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then there's 4 more on the side that we don't see right here. So 14 in this little cabin in this bunkhouse, all kind of smashed together in there. So in the opening of the narrative, I wanted to give you guys pictures so you can kind of picture what it would look like, right? In the opening of the narrative, Douglass recalls the circumstances of his birth and the first few years of his life in Maryland. He was separated from his mother, which he talks about the idea of families being ripped apart. We saw that also in Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. But here we see it in nonfiction, right? So we feel it a little bit even more deeply. Trying to break the natural affection between mother and child, trying to deliberately break families apart so that slave children are more loyal to their masters than their mothers. Now, his mother will travel 12 miles from the plantation she's on at night to sleep next to him. But he really has, other than that, on occasion, he has really no contact with her. He then talks about his father. He knows that his father is a white man, and he suspects that it's Captain Anthony. Captain Anthony is a moderately wealthy man who was a clerk and the supervisor of this vast plantation. Now, that's not the same as an overseer. The clerk and supervisor would have been like an executive assistant to a CEO. I'll put it that way. So Captain Anthony is cruel, and he employs for Colonel Lloyd an even crueler overseer, Mr. Plummer, an alcoholic who whips the slaves. Lloyd was a senator, possibly a governor of Maryland at one point, but a state senator and then a president of the Senate. So he had quite a lot of wealth, and calling him by name, even though this would have been after his death, calling Captain Anthony by name and other people was quite dangerous for Douglas to do, but he does name the people involved directly. Frederick's treatment is shown in contrast to his half-brothers and sisters, who we hear about as well. They're pampered and spoiled, and the slaves are receiving little or no food, few pieces of clothing, so they're getting rations, and they are not sleeping on beds. They're sleeping on dirt floor with a very thin blanket. So this is a picture of two younger slaves, just again so you could get the idea of what this might look like. You can see their clothes, right, torn and quite thin and threadbare, too big on them. They're getting leftover clothes, probably from what some of the adult slaves had worn. And this is about his age at this period of time. Mr. Gore is employed as the new overseer. He completely dominates the slaves, so he forces them to bow down to him. He provokes them so that he can beat them further. After one such beating, we see a slave named Denby who runs into a river to kind of soothe his wounds. Mr. Gore shoots Denby for being in the water. He's never punished or even investigated for the murder, and in fact, he's seen in quite high regard as being a good overseer by the white people who employ him. So these instances of injustices are in Douglas's mind from a very young age. His mother dies, and he really feels nothing, having never known her. And then soon after, he's sent to Baltimore to live with Mr. Hugh Auld, so this is where it gets a bit confusing. Essentially what happens throughout the narrative from this point forward is that he's shuffled to different households based on the whims of the people who own him. So different households are using him for labor, but he still technically belongs to Colonel Lloyd. I think that, the point is, if it's confusing for us, imagine how much more confusing it would have been for him. So he's sent to live with Colonel Lloyd's son-in-law, Mr. Hugh Auld, and the treatment he receives there at first is kinder. Mrs. Auld, wants to teach him how to read, and the slaves in the city have more freedoms than they did on the plantation, in part because in that society of Baltimore, the slave owners want to be seen as being very kind to their slaves, as opposed to on the plantations where being cruel is seen as the better type of treatment. So here we see one of Douglas's later masters, Thomas Auld, and this was his first, Colonel Lloyd, the senator in Maryland. In chapters 7 through 9, so we saw Mrs. Auld being quite kind to him at first because she's never had slaves, and essentially she's taught by her husband how to be cruel. So first she taught Frederick Douglass how to read. Then her husband forbids reading and writing because it will ruin the slaves, and soon she's snatching newspapers out of their sight to make sure that they don't have access to it and can't see words and that kind of thing. In the meantime, Mr. Alds takes to brandy and starts becoming an alcoholic. So his life there was better at first and then goes downhill. He learns in spite of these things. So there are poor white children in the vicinity, and he gives them bread in exchange for lessons and pretends that he knows how to read and write as well as they do from looking at letters on ships and kind of copying them. And eventually he's able to read and write. At the age of 12, he really starts at this point to consider the condition of slavery, what being a slave for life means. He wonders if it can ever change, contemplates suicide, starts to think about running away. And part of this is because he can read, and he finds a book that's an anti-slavery pamphlet showing why slavery is not a logical institution, which urges him on, as do the people that he meets in Baltimore. There are people at the shipyard who talk to him about going to Canada and about running away, and that encourages him quite a bit. When Captain Anthony dies, Douglass is sent back to the plantation, and then he, as I said, he's transported back and forth to different households at the whims of the family. So he is property, or considered property at this point, and as property has to be broken up like among the estate. We saw that again in Uncle Tom's Cabin, right, where these things would happen. One of the things I didn't mention here is what happens to Douglass's grandmother. So his grandmother has been with the family for many years, and now the new owners decide that she can't really work any longer. She's too old, so she's sent out to a cabin and kind of abandoned by them. And he thinks about, the treatment of the elderly in this situation. Eventually, he comes to live with Thomas Auld, again, the man up here. That is Mr. Auld, the first Mr. Auld he lived with. This is his brother. And his brother has a falling out and decides to take Frederick with him. Thomas Auld does not give the slaves enough food, and he becomes even more cruel after getting religion. So there is a large portion of this book looks at the hypocrisy of Christianity and people who are using religion essentially to be crueler to their slaves, which Frederick Douglass describes a little bit more at the end, the differences between the Christianity of Christ and the Christianity as an institution that kind of is upholding slavery. When he is deliberately disobedient, he sets a horse free a number of times. He's sent to live with Covey, a man known for breaking slaves. Now, he's not owned by Covey, but he is sent to live there and work for him. Covey is also religious, at least outwardly, but in addition to sneaking up on the slaves and beating them for no reason, he's purchased several to be breeders. I put that in quotes, so, so-called breeders, but this was not an unusual practice, and Douglass explains how in this situation, there's a hired man who is hired basically to sleep with a slave named Caroline so that Covey can own more slaves. In other instances, it was sometimes the slave owners themselves raping the women to increase their property, essentially. So with Covey, we see Douglass being completely dehumanized. He loses his spirit, his intellect, his desire to learn. He really is broken at this point. And he begs for God to relieve him of the pain. He vows to run away. After the first attempt, he's caught. He fights his Covey, I should say with. He fights with Covey, and he wins, although Covey claims that he won. And as a result of this fight, he's not beaten again for the next 4 years. So there is a tiny bit of reprieve for him. Eventually, he is sent to work for Mr. Friedland, but still owned by Auld and giving Auld his earnings. He's working as a ship's caulker in Baltimore. So he is learning a trade, becomes more valuable as a result. He's getting better treatment from Friedland, but the idea that he has to give Auld his earnings, and Auld seems to kind of see the unfairness of this and gives a little small portion back to Douglas. Like, okay, well, here's a little pocket money, which really makes him even more frustrated. So at this point, we don't have too many details about his escape. I have linked for you a document with excerpts from My Bondage and My Freedom, his longer book, which details his escape more. At the time that he wrote this book, was before. I'm sorry, let me reword that. He wrote this book before abolition, in part to persuade people that slavery should be ended. The second book, My Bondage and My Freedom, he wrote later, giving more details about his life. So at this point, he's still concerned that if other people try to escape the same way he did, that they could be caught because white readers might know how he had escaped and they would be on the lookout for it. So the details of that are in the document for you on Blackboard. But what he does is he gets false papers. He boards a train. The person on the train can't read, ironically, even though Frederick Douglass can read, and just sort of stamps the papers saying, okay, you're a free black person and therefore you can travel. He also steals a uniform to make himself appear more official. I think a ship's worker's uniform, I want to say. So Anna had helped him to do this, and he meets up with Anna in New York, and then they settle in New Bedford, where they have some abolitionist friends, but they still face some discrimination. So what he thinks the North is going to be is quite different from the reality. So there is Frederick Douglass a little bit after that point in time, and there is Anna, his first wife. Okay, so that is pretty much the story. I want to read you an excerpt, and then we'll look at some other books for the read-alikes. I was seldom whipped by my old master, and suffered little from anything else than hunger and cold. I suffered much from hunger, but much more from cold. In hottest summer and coldest winter, I was kept almost naked. No shoes, no stockings, no jacket, no trousers. Nothing on but a coarse tow linen shirt, reaching only to my knees. I had no bed. I must have perished with cold, but the coldest nights I used to steal a bag, which was used for carrying corn to the mill. I would crawl into this bag and there sleep on the cold, damp clay floor, with my head in and my feet out. My feet had been so cracked with the frost that the pen with which I am writing might be laid in the gashes. We were not regularly allowanced. Our food was coarse cornmeal boiled. This was called mush. It was put into a large wooden tray or trough and set down upon the ground. The children were then called, like so many pigs, and like so many pigs they would come and devour the mush, some with oyster shells, others with a piece of shingle, some with naked hands, and none with spoons. He that ate fastest got most. He that was strongest secured the best place, and few left the trough satisfied. I was probably between 7 and 8 years old when I left Colonel Lloyd's plantation. I left it with joy. So this, you can see the treatment here, particularly of the children who cannot work. So those that survive this treatment are put to work, and those that don't. And the horrors here described, I think, Harriet Beecher Stowe is trying to use sentimentality to convince her readers, but the plain facts of his story to me at least, are much more emotional even than that other book. So I hope that you do, enjoy is a weird word for this type of a book, but I think it is a good book, and it certainly is an important one, and I hope that you do enjoy reading it. If you do, here are some read-alikes. So My Bondage and My Freedom, the longer version of his life story. And I only didn't choose that one just because of time. It just takes a little bit more time to get through, and I find that the narrative had a little bit of a different place in history, so looking at that one instead. But My Bondage and My Freedom is a wonderful book, and if you want to read more about Frederick Douglass, it's a great place to go. Another slave narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Harriet Jacobs was in a position where she may have been sexually assaulted, and so she writes about how she escaped that situation. 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup, again, great book. Beloved by Toni Morrison kind of tackles some of these issues from a perspective several years removed, and it is part ghost story, part historical fiction. It's a really fascinating book. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou is another, in this case, a memoir. And it doesn't take place, obviously, during these years, but Maya Angelou's story of being impoverished, of facing racism, sexism, and other traumas that she has to endure, and then how she comes out of it, in part, like Frederick Douglass, through education. So there's a lot of similarities there. And then I also included this one, The Hate You Give, more recent book. And again, it is... the word thug spelled out there. The Hate You Give looks at issues of racism today, and it's meant to be a YA book for young adults, but in my opinion, it can really be read by anyone and appreciated by anyone. And the themes there are quite strong, as is the story. A lot of reflection of how these institutions from the past have still affected our society today, and how racism is still prevalent and the need to eliminate it. So I hope that after this class is done, you might be interested in picking up some of these. And next time we're going to look at slave narratives in general, some of which are seen here, and what they were, why they were written, and some of the features of those books. So that's it. I look forward to your thoughts. Thanks, everybody.